When we talk about future energy, you probably picture solar panels, maybe wind turbines, right?
Mm-hmm. The usual suspects.
But what if, a familiar chemical, one we've used for ages, could be absolutely key to a greener future? Kind of makes you think.
It really does. It's fascinating how something so basic to agriculture, to industry, is suddenly being looked at in this whole new light for the energy transition.
Exactly. Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're digging into the feasibility of trading green ammonia globally. We're grounding our discussion in a pretty detailed piece of research called Feasibility of Green Ammonia Trading via Pipelines and Shipping. Cases of Europe, North Africa, and South America.
Yeah, and just for simplicity today, we'll probably just call it this study.
Good plan. And
Yep.
this study gives us a really useful way to think about whether this future is actually workable, moving green ammonia, the kind made with renewable power, from places with lots of sun and wind to places that really need the energy.
It's a critical question.
Yeah.
Can it actually be done practically?
So, our mission for this deep dive is pretty clear. Let's unpack what this study found. Can we figure out the nuts and bolts of a potential global green ammonia trade? We'll look at transport pipelines, ships, and the all-important economics, all based on the analysis in this study.
Okay, let's jump in. Why ammonia? Why is it even in the running for future energy?
Right. Well, to get that, you need to remember how important ammonia is now.
Hmm.
Globally, we use something like 185 million tons every single year.
Wow, that's a lot.
It is. And the biggest chunk, maybe 70% of that, goes into fertilizer. Basically, it feeds the world. The rest supports all sorts of industrial processes.
Okay, but producing all that ammonia today, it comes at quite an environmental cost, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The traditional way, using natural gas, sometimes coal, it's responsible for about 1.8% of all global CO2 emissions. That's huge.
1.8%. So something essential is also a major climate problem.
Exactly. And that's where this idea of greeny ammonia comes in.
Right. So what makes it green? How's it different? So the E stands for electrolysis. You use renewable electricity, solar, wind to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. Big green hydrogen, that's the key. You then combine it with nitrogen, which you just pull from the air using the standard Haber-Bosch process.
Yeah.
But the crucial difference, the energy source is clean, renewable.
Got it. So potentially zero carbon emissions in the production. Now, this study points to some pretty big numbers for future ammonia demand.
It really does. The projections show demand increasing, well, significantly. By 2050, they're talking ranges like 475 up to maybe 340 terawatt hours, measured in lower heating value.
And even further out.
By 2100, it could be massive, potentially up to 10,770 terawatt hours. And interestingly, a really big slice of that future demand, maybe around 420 terawatt hours just by 2050, could come from shipping.
Shipping as a fuel for ships.
Exactly. Ammonia is being seriously looked at as a cleaner marine fuel alternative. That would be a huge shift for a sector that's, another big emitter.
Makes sense. And it's not just about burning ammonia directly, right? It's also seen as a way to move hydrogen around.
That's another big part of the picture. Hydrogen itself is great. Clean energy carrier, but it's bulky, low energy density by volume. It's tricky to store and transport long distances efficiently.
Right.
So you convert the hydrogen to ammonia, which is much denser, easier to handle, ship it, maybe store it, and then potentially convert it back to hydrogen if needed, or use the ammonia directly.
Okay. And this study mentions we're already seeing projects pop up, green e-ammonia projects.
Yeah, the number of planned projects is definitely growing, which of course immediately brings up the next question.
Oh,
How do you move all this stuff?
the infrastructure challenge.
Exactly. You need a reliable transport infrastructure. And this study really emphasizes this point about energy sovereignty and security too. Having dependable supplies of key stuff like ammonia is vital.
How does green ammonia play into that security aspect?
Well, think about it. Instead of relying on maybe just a few sources for fossil fuels, often in politically sensitive areas, you could potentially source green ammonia from diverse regions with good renewables. That spreads the risk, right? It could make countries less vulnerable to supply disruptions.
Like the example they brought up, the Togliatti-Odessa pipeline. What happened there?
Yeah, that was a major pipeline for ammonia, mostly for fertilizer. When it was disrupted because of the geopolitical situation, it had real knock-on effects on food prices and security in several places.
A stark reminder.
It really highlights the risks of depending on these single choke points. Green ammonia, potentially produced more widely and shipped flexibly, could offer, more resilience.
Okay, so demand's likely growing, transport is key, security is a factor. Where can we make this green ammonia most cheaply? The study talks about cost advantages in certain regions.
This is absolutely central to the trade argument. The study points to places with fantastic solar resources,
Yep.
like Morocco or the Atacama Desert in Chile. Their advantage, really low-cost renewable electricity.
That's the main driver for lower production cost.
Primarily, yes. And this study actually references some earlier work by Fasihi and others from 2021,
Ah, yeah.
which suggested these prime spots could hit e-ammonia costs below 600 euros per ton. That's roughly 114 euros per megawatt hour, even back around 2020.
Wow, already.
And looking out to 2050, those costs might drop dramatically, maybe down to like 260 euros a ton or 50 euros per megawatt hour. Really cheap, potentially.
Okay, those are the potential exporters. Now, this study contrasts them with likely importers, Germany, Finland, Spain. How do their potential local production costs look?
Right, so this study looks at these European countries as importers, maybe because they have less ideal renewable conditions or less land available for massive solar or wind farms. The study estimates their 2030 production costs. Let's see, Finland, maybe 103 to 155 euros per megawatt hour. Germany, a bit lower, 82 to 119. And Spain, 77 to about 127 euros per megawatt hour.
So still quite a bit higher than those potential rock bottom costs in Chile or Morocco, especially looking towards 2050.
Exactly. And those local production costs become the benchmark, the
Mhm.
price to beat for imports.
Okay, so we've got cheap potential production hubs and potential importers with higher local costs. How do we connect them? This study looked hard at pipelines and shipping. Let's take pipelines first, specifically the Morocco to Europe case.
Yes, this study modeled pipelines starting from Ouarzazate in Morocco, a good solar spot. They calculated distances to Germany, about 2,000 and 860 kilometers, plus a 20% detour factor they added in. Finland, even further, over 4,000 kilometers plus detour. Spain, closer, around 30,045 kilometers plus detour.
Long distances and the cost finding from this study.
Well, the big takeaway was that pipelines from Morocco look significantly more expensive than shipping it all the way from Chile, particularly for Germany and Finland.
Really?
Then-
Even though Morocco was closer?
Yeah. For 2030, the estimated pipeline costs from Morocco were, to Finland, 47 to 66 euros per megawatt hour. Germany, 33 to 47. Spain, being closest, was the lowest at around 16 euros per megawatt hour. Now, they do project those costs will come down by 2050.
Okay, some improvement expected.
But even so, this study concluded that pipelines really only look economically better for quite short distances, like maybe up to 140, 180 kilometers.
That's surprisingly short.
It is. Beyond that, the cost just ramps up too much compared to other options, according to their analysis.
Okay, so for the long haul, shipping seems to be the way to go based on this study. Let's look at the Chile to Europe route.
Exactly. This study examined shipping from Antofagasta in Chile to Hamburg in Germany, that's nearly 13,000 kilometers. To Porvoo in Finland, over 14,500 kilometers. And Tarragona in Spain, also around 13,000 kilometers.
Big sea journeys, and the costs compared to those long pipelines.
Significantly cheaper, according to the study. For 2030, shipping from Chile to Germany or Spain was estimated between 9.2 and 12.7 euros per megawatt hour. To Finland, a touch higher, 10.3 to 14.1 euros. Much lower than the pipeline figures for those distances.
It's a huge difference.
Yeah. And again, this study projects a slight decrease in these shipping costs by 2050 as well.
And what does that shipping cost cover? What parts of the chain did this study include?
They looked at the whole chain. Storage tanks at both ends, the export terminal facilities, the specialized ammonia carrier ships themselves, and the import terminal for unloading.
Okay, comprehensive. So we have production costs, we have transport costs via pipeline and ship, all laid out in this study. Now, the million-dollar question: how does importing stack up against making it locally in Germany, Finland, or Spain? What did this study find on economic feasibility?
Right. This is where it gets really interesting. This study consistently found that importing from Morocco using pipelines was the most expensive route for all three European countries. More expensive than just making it themselves locally in pretty much all scenarios they looked at.
So the pipeline idea from Morocco, at least for those long distances, doesn't look great economically in their analysis.
Not based on these findings, no. But importing from Chile via shipping, that painted a different picture, especially for Germany and Finland.
How so?
This study suggests that for Germany and Finland, bringing in green ammonia from Chile by ship could actually be cheaper than domestic production. They calculated potential savings of 10 to 33% between 2030 and 2050.
10 to 33%, that's That's pretty substantial.
It is. It definitely makes you think about where investment might flow domestic plants versus import terminals and infrastructure if those numbers hold up.
What about Spain? You mentioned they have decent solar potential themselves. How does it look for them in this study?
Spain's situation was more nuanced in the findings. Yes, importing from Chile by ship might look good in the 2030s, maybe offering some savings, but this study suggests that after 2040 or so, Spain's own solar-powered ammonia production could become just as cheap, or maybe even cheaper, than importing it from Chile.
Interesting. So their domestic potential really starts to compete later on.
Exactly. It shows how specific a country's own resources are to this whole import versus local production calculation.
And did this study consider shipping from Morocco as well, not just pipelines?
Yes, they did. And that added another layer. The analysis indicated that by 2050, shipping ammonia from Morocco could actually become cost competitive with shipping it all the way from Chile for some destinations.
So the transport mode is critical, not just the origin.
Absolutely. Pipeline versus ship makes a massive difference to the economics, according to the study.
Okay, so we've focused a lot on the costs. What about the bigger picture? What other implications did this study discuss?
Well, it naturally brings up the huge potential for green ammonia to decarbonize other sectors. We mentioned shipping fuel, but also replacing conventional ammonia and fertilizers is massive for reducing agricultural emissions.
Right, cleaning up existing uses.
Exactly. This study also touches on how green ammonia stacks up against conventional gray ammonia, made from fossil fuels, and blue ammonia, which uses carbon capture. The competitiveness there really depends heavily on things like natural gas prices.
Which are volatile.
It's very volatile, exactly. But also, crucially, the environmental benefit of green ammonia becomes a major factor, especially if there are carbon taxes or strong climate policies.
And the hydrogen carrier angle. Any more insight from this study there?
They did mention it. The study suggests that, look, while ammonia can carry hydrogen, if your end goal is purely to use hydrogen, transporting hydrogen directly might actually be more efficient overall. You avoid the energy losses and costs of converting ammonia back to hydrogen at the destination.
So it depends on the end use.
Precisely. Is the ammonia the fuel or chemical you need, or is it just a taxi for hydrogen?
Got it. And we talked about energy security earlier. This study reinforces that.
Definitely. This study really highlights how developing green ammonia capabilities, whether through domestic production where feasible or through diversified international trade partnerships, can boost energy security. It means less reliance on potentially unstable single sources and could also create jobs locally in renewables and chemical processing.
Of course, any study like this has assumptions and limitations. Did the authors point any out?
Yes, they were clear about that. This study acknowledged, the uncertainties around future cost reductions for renewables and electrolyzers. Those are projections after all, and it focused on very specific routes in just a few countries.
So not the whole world map.
No, they suggest future work could look at more potential exporting regions, maybe Australia or the Middle East, and also consider other transport options. Think about rail or trucks, especially for getting the ammonia from the port to the actual end user, that last mile.
Right, that last bit of the journey matters too. Okay, we have certainly taken a deep dive into feasibility of green ammonia trading via pipelines and shipping, cases of Europe, North Africa, and South America. If you had to boil it down, what are the key insights we should take away?
I think the absolute core message from our exploration of this study is that whether global green ammonia trade makes sense really hinges on two big things: transportation costs and how the production costs in those renewable places stack up against producing it locally where it's needed.
And the transport method, pipeline versus ship, is a huge part of that cost equation.
An absolutely massive part, as this study demonstrated. It can totally change the economics depending on the distance and destination.
So considering everything we've unpacked from this study, here's something for you, the listener, to ponder. What kind of big strategic decisions do governments and industries need to start making now? Should they push hard to build the infrastructure for international green ammonia trade, banking on imports? Or should they prioritize boosting domestic production capacity, even if it might initially cost more?
Yeah, how do you balance the economics identified in this study with goals around energy independence, job creation, and of course the urgent need to decarbonize? It's a complex strategic puzzle.
It really is. It involves thinking about long-term investments, supportive policies, balancing global trade potential with national energy security and environmental goals. A lot to weigh up.
Definitely a lot to consider.
Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us today into feasibility of green ammonia trading via pipelines and shipping, cases of Europe, North Africa, and South America. It certainly opened my eyes to the surprising and complex potential of green ammonia in our energy future.